Okay, so hello and welcome to the first of our UNISON Northern online series, Green Jobs, Secure Futures, in which we'll be exploring what needs to be done to tackle the climate crisis, what that work looks like in terms of jobs for the North, and how we go about creating or transitioning to those jobs. We'll be looking to answer those questions through a series of 5 virtual events running through from this month, August, through to the end of the year. Tonight is the first of those events and the theme is Secure Jobs and Futures for the North. And I'm joined by 4 speakers who I'll introduce in turn as we go along. We're going to hear from each of our 4 speakers and then there'll be an opportunity for questions. If you haven't had questions submitted in advance, you can also ask questions in the comments section of the video on Facebook as we go along. So without further ado, we'll go to our first speaker, who's our UNISON Northern Regional Secretary, Clare Williams, to set the context of this discussion for us. So Clare, you've led and continue to lead the support to our UNISON branches and our members across the Northern region throughout COVID. What do you think you can tell us about the context in which we're operating as a result of COVID when we're looking ahead to tackle the climate crisis?
Okay, thanks for that, Rona, and I'm really pleased to have been asked and participating in our first of a series of climate change events. You know, I do want to try and give a bit of context to the sort of world that UNISON operates in, and then I'll sort of conclude with talking a bit about what UNISON's doing and how we're really keen, most importantly, through these events to get more of our members involved in our climate work, but also build our the depth of the work that we're doing with employers across the region. I think that the other speakers that we've got tonight are, you know, really high quality. So I think this is a great start. So, you know, from a UNISON perspective, I think we do need to be clear that we feel very strongly and actually have had very progressive policies about the need as a trade union for us to be at the forefront of tackling the climate emergency. But the reality is that, you know, I think often when you listen to some politicians and some people, you would think that we're talking about a climate emergency, that at some point in the future. The reality is that it's happening now. And unless we work together to stop it, that our planet will change in drastic ways, and actually our future is deeply uncertain. You know, I believe, as does UNISON, that the challenge around climate change is probably the greatest single threat that humanity currently faces. The UK Committee on Climate Change has said that this next decade is critical. So for me, you know, UNISON is the largest trade union in the UK. We're a public sector trade union. We've got around 1.4 million members and we deliver across all sectors. So it's quite clear from a UNISON perspective, we've got a vital role to play in campaigning for, you know, greener politics, working with employers, and I'll come on to the work we're doing with people in this region to make our workplaces more sustainable, but also informing and indeed engaging our members in this really critical area of work. So, you know, as I've said, our UNISON members work in a range of jobs that have direct environmental roles, actually. So, you know, work in parks, in energy and water companies, environment agencies, meat hygiene, environmental health. You know, we work in schools, we work on buses and transport, in waste recycling and planning. So, you know, that starts to give people, I think, a flavour of why this is such an important issue for us, but actually why UNISON and trade unions are so crucial in coming up with ideas in how we can tackle the significant challenges that we face. And as I've said, you know, that is across all public services, local government, health, police and justice, fire and rescue, transport, and indeed, and I'll come on to this further, and higher education. So I think, you know, as a trade union, we are really proud of the work we've been doing around this agenda, both with members, with other campaigning organisations and employers, but clearly that there is an urgency to this, and there's a collective urgency. I think, you know, part of what we're doing as well is working with employers to say, how as public sector organisations can we collectively reduce the carbon footprints? We've got actually lots of public sector buildings, and again, I'll come on to this in a bit, that through years of underfunding actually aren't fit for purpose and often aren't green, they're not sustainable, and they're inefficient. And, you know, I think we're seeing good examples again in this region where we've got some local authorities, Newcastle, led by Nick and Labour Group, who have been really investing in making buildings greener and reducing that carbon footprint. I mean, I think also, as a trade union, you know, a key part of our campaigning is to bring to the conversation that that thing that you've talked about, Rona, about how do we achieve the change, and how do we achieve that in a way that engages people, that people don't feel worried and concerned about their jobs, and therefore don't feel defensive, but actually working with trade unions and employers. You know, that's what we mean around when we talk about having a just transition. So a transition plan that takes us from where we are today in a very positive and sustainable way, both to achieve the targets that we've got to meet, but actually to support people so that people don't think, well, that's all great, but I'm going to lose my job. No, actually it's about what type of jobs we want to create and what type of investment and where we prioritize that investment. And I think that is really important for us to be able to take people with us. I think, you know, it's absolutely clear for me that the reliance that there's been actually internationally, and that includes our own national government, that has sort of said, well, look, the approach to this can in any way be private sector led or through a voluntary approach, isn't going to deliver the change we need in the time that we need it. And that's why UNISON is very clear that public services and public service investment has actually got to be at the heart of the change, and working with local authorities and having much more ability for local councils and local decision makers to take control of some of these decisions to bring about that change. I do want to quickly reference something that UNISON is keen to support and promote as well, because clearly we do organise internationally, and that's why it's important to talk about our own local workplaces, but then our national and then our international footprint, because the world is so connected. And one of the things that I find quite interesting is this campaign to promote a Robin Hood tax for the climate, which essentially would be about saying, you know, those fossil fuel companies, and I think I saw some research that said actually there's around 100 fossil fuel companies who are responsible for over half of the world's emissions and are making massive profit. So it is perfectly reasonable, I think, to promote something like a Robin Hood tax for the climate, where that would take some funding from those big profit makers and would become a motivation to start investing not in fossil fuels and in renewable energy, and actually provide some funding that could then be utilised to take that work forward. UNISON is also part of the campaign that, you know, with the target of reaching actually net zero emissions by at least 2030. And actually currently the UK government's target is 2050. So, you know, our view is that that is far too long into the future, and that I think was part of my point at the start about climate emergency isn't something in the future, it's today, it's here and now. But to be able to make any real and significant progress, it's absolutely apparent that there is an urgent need for significant levels of additional funding, and particularly around public sector investment, both on that national scale, international, but on our local and regional scale. And I guess, you know, I think now I'd want to touch a little bit on some of the work that local authorities and other public sector organisations and employers have been doing with UNISON to try and start to address some of these issues. And I guess, do it in a way that breaks down what can feel for some people this, massive issue, and you think, how can I as an individual hope to make any difference with that? And I think what we can demonstrate is if we bring people together, actually all of us can make quite a significant difference. So, there's hundreds of councils across the UK have already declared a climate emergency, and I think I'm really pleased that there's a lot of councils in our region who have declared a climate emergency, and I think, I can leave Nick to talk more about the detail of that, because I think what Unison's clear about is, we want climate emergencies declared, but we want them actually to mean something. So it's not just about saying, well, this is great, and Newcastle Council declared a climate emergency. Actually, what do you mean by declaring that climate emergency, and what practical steps are taking place to affect that positive change? Also in the region, we've been working as Unison with hospitals, NHS trusts, with other public sector organisations, and again, Newcastle Hospitals, as it happens, was, I think, the first NHS trust nationally to declare a climate emergency. So, from a Unison Northern perspective, and indeed from this event, I think we're really well placed in the North East, not just to be participating in this, but actually to be influencing and be leading on the climate challenge work that we've got to do. And as I've said, that is about us looking at policies, but it's very much about us looking at what type of buildings we have, what type of workplace policies do we have, what type of jobs do we want to invest in, how do we use our procurement policies actually to procure around green energy. And again, I think Nick and others will be well placed to talk about that in more detail. The other area that Unison organises in is in the energy sector. And again, I think, when we're talking about a just transition, for us, it's quite clear that there's a fairly straightforward answer. We should have public ownership of the energy retail market. That would mean that customers would be able to choose renewable energy sources. Actually, there would be savings made, and you would protect jobs. And, we're already seeing in this region that the energy sector is in quite a lot of trouble. We're seeing hundreds of jobs being lost in Northern Energy in Sunderland. So again, just a government that says, well, the current approach is working isn't. So I think it really is time for alternatives, and I guess that leads me neatly into something that you referenced, Rona. And I don't think we can have any conversations now really about what type of alternative ways of organising society without referencing what the catastrophe of COVID-19 has exposed. And without doubt, Unison, Nick and others, we've been working for years on highlighting the impact of the Conservative government's political and financial policies that had already been causing our public services in the region significant pressures, because the level of funding was being reduced year on year, and the level of need for those services was increasing year on year. And, that's across all public services, but without doubt, local government has been at the forefront of that. And, I think it's a credit actually to people like Nick and other Labour councillors and leaders who have continued to meet what feels like a fairly increasing impossible challenge of delivering services with not enough funding. And the importance of highlighting that, I think, in relation to what type of approach we have around a real proper Green New Deal and being able to invest in green jobs and a different type of future, is you have to understand the choices that people are being asked to make. And already, we had a government that said do whatever is required to meet the needs around COVID-19, but actually the funding stream's not come through. So for me, from a Unison perspective, that means that people are going to be asked to make very difficult choices. And if you've not got enough money, are you going to be able to continue a sustained investment and financial commitment to moving towards green jobs, investing in, you know, green infrastructure, investing in a green economy, if actually you haven't got enough money to deliver adult social care, as an example. So, you know, the context of these conversations, I think, are really, really important, because green sustainable jobs aren't just going to grow themselves. This region is seeing, I think, very, very significantly the impact of having, you know, a large number of jobs that have been reliant on hospitality or a service sector, or are in very precarious, insecure jobs, and they're not sustainable, you know, when we've seen what the impact of COVID has been. So for me, it is the opportunity and it is the moment that we collectively have to grasp that conversation about, well, actually, we want real and proper and sustained investment from government in our public services. That means public services would be well placed to be leading the challenge around climate change and developing a proper Green New Deal. We actually need investment in quality jobs that are talking about, you know, jobs that are promoting from that green agenda, whether that be, you know, and in this region, we've got some fantastic examples around, you know, wind power, around research. We've got large organizations in the private sector, such as Nissan, where we should be looking to try and invest in a green approach, green infrastructure, you know, green transport. So for me, it's a particularly important time to be having those conversations. And, you know, UNISON wants to be right at the heart of that with local authorities, with MPs, and with other decision makers to campaign for that investment from government, but investment in the right things, to work with employers so that we are reducing our carbon footprint in workplaces, you know, to establish really robust green networks. So UNISON, we have our own green network as a trade union, but I'm really keen that we open that up to, you know, to councillors, to MPs, and build that biggest and deepest green campaigning agenda. You know, UNISON's using our learning agenda to reach out to our members to try and help support skills training so that people can look at getting different jobs. We want to develop, you know, green jobs that are well paid, that are sustainable, because actually then that starts to give us solutions to some of the big challenges in this region about the high levels of unemployment. Let's create our own jobs in the region that people in the region can then be supported through further and higher education and training to be able to do. And that then will help generate our regional and local economy. But I think that also needs to be part of our conversation about what type of devolution arrangements we want in the Northern region. And again, UNISON, you know, is a key organisation within that conversation. UNISON also, we've got sort of an annual Green Day, we've had a Green Week, and I think those things are really important. But in reality, I think we're at the point now where we need to be having, you know, every day should, in a sense, be a green conversation day. Every week should be a green conversation week. We want to continue to engage our UNISON young members, but also young people in colleges, in universities and schools to say, what type of jobs do you want, and what type of things do you want and think we should be doing in the here and now to make sure that we do address the challenges and actually there is a future for humanity and the planet going forwards. And I think, you know, the start of this conversation is just so important, and they're just some of the things that I think from a UNISON perspective we would like people to think about and for us to be part of that conversation. And I'll leave it there, Rona, so I'm conscious of the time, but, you know, hopefully that's just helped to set out some thoughts for people. Thanks very much.
Definitely. Thank you very much, Claire, for setting out that context in which we're operating, which you've pointed out is it's essentially a jobs and an economic crisis. on a health crisis, on a climate crisis. So I think when we're looking at that combination of issues, it's really easy to see how climate change could quite quickly fall to the bottom of the agenda. But actually, aside from the urgency that you've set out that climate change demands, the solutions, as you've also pointed out, present solutions to many of the other problems that we're facing. So it's in all of our interests not to let that fall to the bottom of the pile. And on that note, I'll turn to our second speaker, Mavreen Ncube, who is chair of our regional Black Members Network, but here today in her capacity as a cognitive behavioural therapist with Cumbria, Northumberland, Tyne-and-Wear NHS Trust. So Mavreen, one of the obstacles that we as a species seem to repeatedly face when we're talking about climate change around the world is that we, and this is myself included, have a really natural human reaction to kind of put our head in the sand because it's quite overwhelming. And not only are the impacts of climate change quite frightening, but the solutions can often, I think, seem quite confusing and unclear because of sometimes how they're presented. So, and also we've got sometimes the solution being presented as individual responses where actually it's a collective issue and it needs a collective response. So I suppose in your experience from a psychological perspective, what's your view on how best to approach overwhelming challenges like that on the scale of climate change and on the scale of COVID-19? And what advice would you give to kind of me and our activists on how to talk about climate change in a way that's engaging to our members and the public in general and not off-putting, if that's not too much of a big question to answer?
Thank you very much, Rona, for inviting me to such an important debate regarding climate change. One of the major things that when we talk about climate change is exactly as you've highlighted, is our approach as individuals and the scaremongering tactics potentially that we hear about, you know, individual responsibility about climate change. And one of the things that I'm going to touch on today is obviously, again, what you said earlier on about the collective approach we can all take as a union and as individuals in terms of climate change. So climate change is one of the most complex issues facing us today, as we all recognize. It involves many dimensions: science, economics, social, politics, moral and ethical questions that some people struggle with. And it is a global problem felt on local scales that will be around for decades, even centuries to come, if we don't deal with it. So as highlighted, firstly, it seems clear that as a generation, Rona, we have serious responsibility not to inflict severe climate damages onto the future. And that's a very big responsibility, and that some people can't comprehend. And if we think about the idea of such a big responsibility, it takes us to start thinking about climate change in a very different way. As activists, we need to start thinking about what individuals and collective actions we need to take. It is therefore imperative that we as a union decide what we are going to do as a collective and what we're going to achieve as individuals. There are a number of factors that impact on individuals' ability to start engaging in climate change and the debate. For example, the way we think about climate change is very important, and is one thing to recognize. A lot of us, probably for lack of information or just the fear around you know, the big responsibility that I alluded to earlier on, might make people just shy away and remain in denial or have fear that they can't possibly have anything to contribute to this debate. The second thing is the way we feel about climate change, and the third thing being our behavior towards climate change. So as activists, if we don't feel a particular way about climate change, our behaviors are likely to mimic that. So we are likely to not be engaging in the debate. We are likely not to engage in some of the recommendations that are put forward around climate change, because if we don't really particularly have a positive experience about climate change, or we don't think it's useful, or we worry about the value that we're going to put on climate change, we're likely to do very little. So therefore, that's when behavior is also impacted on. So you'll find, again, I'll come back to the idea of being in denial. So when people are in denial about climate change, we negate or ignore or otherwise avoid acknowledging the unsettling facts about climate change. We find refuge in fear and guilt. So we just continue feeling guilty or feeling fearful about climate change, but never actually doing anything about it. So how can we engage others in order to be successful? So one of the things that when I do research around climate change and kind of talk to people about it, first thing to recognize is that studies persistently show that simply providing people with facts about climate change doesn't reliably change their minds. Yeah, just saying, you need to change climate change. Those simple facts don't really change people's minds. One approach that can help people change people's minds is motivating others to take action around climate change and to emphasize relatively simple things that we can do as individuals in our daily lives. We'll find that by just sending those simple messages, you might start to change people's minds and people's mindset, rather than sending kind of facts that people don't really resonate with or don't really understand. So what I mean by simple things that we can do as individuals in our daily lives is, this could include taking a train to work one day a week. Yeah, it's not too much to ask a person, particularly if people have long commutes and they've got children. So if you start to kind of bring simple messages like, take the train one day to work, you're reducing your carbon footprint. The next thing that we can start to talk about is, instead of foregoing all flights abroad, encouraging people to kind of skip one flight a year or using other modes of transport to try and reduce their carbon footprint. And other simple things that we can start to kind of help people, particularly within our activists, is bringing usable bags to the supermarket, or cutting down on the amount of plastics that we use that will end up in the sea. So we are talking about really practical solutions here that we can start to have that one-to-one conversations with our activists. Simple information that one can take. They might not be able to change the whole thing, but if we all start to take simple steps around climate change, that collective approach will start to help. Individual approach will lead into collective approach, which leads to the wider kind of positive change towards climate change. And again, as a union, we know we are at the forefront of collective action. So collective action plays a significant role in enhancing adaptive capacity, and hence should be more strongly considered in the development of climate change adaptation strategies. So if we think about what we do as a union, we are good at, collective bargaining. We're good at kind of mobilizing and ensuring that we're speaking a shared interest. And we voluntarily engage in common action to pursue the shared interest. And that's the thing that we want to talk about. So my next thing is around, what are the practical steps we need to take as a union, as activists, in order to start this debate around climate change. So we need to get organized within our different self-organized groups and make the agenda on climate change a priority. I'm speaking for the Black Members Self-Organized Group. It is something that we talk about, but we need to now bring it at the forefront of our debates and our discussion. What can we do as a Black Members Self-Organized Group in order to start talking about global climate change? What can we do as a group to ensure that our members know about climate change, and what they can do as individuals and what we can do as a collective? The next thing is, in order to get others interested in engaging in the climate change agenda, we as a union need to ensure that we have coordinated activity on climate change, including climate change series, just like the one we are having today. When we start having conversations about climate change, we're likely to reach a wider audience within our region, but also within a wider context, within a wider union, as well as the community. And in addition to that, we need to ensure that we've got accessible information and resources available to share. We can have these discussions about climate change when we do our recruitment events, when we have our seminars, when we have our conferences. This is when we can start really talking about climate change and ensuring that it's reaching not just the ears of the few, but the ears of the many, because the more people know about climate change and really understand it from their own individual point of view and as to what they can do, we'll start to see change that is more of an individual basis that then leads into the collective campaign that we're talking about. So finally, Rona, to answer your question, what are the positive steps we can take, or as an activist, we can take to change, to keep the climate agenda, or climate change agenda on the forefront? The first step, again, is to get people engaged in the climate change debate. Let's talk about it. Let's meet about it. Let's organize. You know, we're as a union, we're activists. That's what we're good at: organizing and meeting, and actually having that shared interest around climate change will get us to a point where, you know, it's going to reach the ears of many, and we're going to start to see changes. The next thing is, again, as activists, ensuring that our voices are heard. You know, there's power in having our voices heard. So, you know, we need to join into campaigns around climate change. Let our local MPs know about what we're doing and the importance of this debate around climate change. And the next thing is being informed. We need to stay informed as a union. As an activist, you need to be informed about what climate change is and the global impact of climate change. And not just for us now, but for the future generations to come. As I alluded to at the beginning, we have a massive responsibility as a generation to ensure that this world is here for many years to come, and for the future of our humanity and the future of the world, not just for us as humans, but for the species on this world and everything else that relies heavily on a good climate. And finally, one responsibility for activists is just, let's start thinking about traveling responsibly. You know, if we're going to conferences, you're going to a meeting, car sharing, ensuring that, you know, you're reducing your carbon footprint if you can at any given time. That's all for me, Rona, at this stage. I don't know if you've got any questions for me so far, or I'll just pass you back to you.
Thank you, Mavreen. I think that's really helpful, and I think it's really excellently framed the series going forward and our response regionally on how we communicate on this really, really important issue. And you know, you've made it clear we need to be positive and accessible and focus on those practical solutions. So no questions at the minute, and I know you do need to shoot off, but thank you so much. And so having had that motivation from Mavreen about how we need to go forward and engage and organise people, we'll go to our next speaker, Dr. Stephen Hall, who's the programme leader for Sustainable Cities, the Sustainable Cities Masters course, which is part of the School of Earth and Environment at the University of Leeds. So Stephen, people often talk about climate change as if it's a problem that we don't know how to tackle. And I think Mavreen set out how that can be very off-putting. But I don't think it's correct all the time, because my understanding is that we do know how to tackle the problem, but the political will, if you like, has not always been there. And I think we've seen that start to change, particularly over the last couple of years, whether from the school strikers, Extinction Rebellion, people supporting a Green New Deal. But I think even for those of us who support action on climate change, it can still be unclear what that looks like in practice, and trying to imagine and envision that in our minds. So can you try to, for us, set out the challenge ahead and give us a kind of summary of what that work is that needs to be done to tackle climate change? I know you might have some slides to try and share, so we'll give that a go, see if technology is going to let us do that, but over to you.
Let's see, after many months of teaching online, whether I'm slicker at this than I was at the beginning. Are we seeing slides? I hope we're seeing slides. Tell me if we're seeing slides.
Yes.
We are. Marvellous. Okay. Yeah, so it falls to me to be neither positive nor practical. No, I'm kidding. What I wanted to do is, the title that I got was the work that needs to be done to tackle climate change. And I want to talk a little bit about the work of the hands and the work of the heads. So to begin with, I'm just going to walk through some of the things that we kind of know we need to do, but are not individual decisions. There's some things that are not within our ability to do on our own. And the kind of empowerment that you find people, the empowered people working on climate change are not just taking individual action. So one of the first things is just to think about electricity and like the basic simple enough service of electricity and what it means to transition our electricity system to be compatible with net zero. And it means closing coal-fired power plants. We can't run coal-fired power plants anymore, really. And that means that the jobs that were in coal-fired power plants are no longer viable. It's the most obvious one because they're quite large employers. They're usually in relatively, what's the deprived regions, but they're usually placed in regions that are former coal regions anyway. So it's not like they haven't had some economic shock in the first place. And then when something like Fiddler's Ferry closes, then it's who is it beholden on to find, not necessarily find jobs for that workforce, but to ensure some sort of just transition. And SSE has been the first of the utilities to pledge to draw up just transition plans that explicitly saying that some of these fossil assets are going to have to close. And one of the reasons why they were able to draw up those the just transition plans was because they were pushed by shareholders, and the shareholders were NGOs as well as individuals. And that has been a heartening thing to announce, but what that will actually look like, particularly when you're losing a lot of jobs from a single place in an already depressed area, is yet to be seen. I would question how transferable the skills of running a coal-fired power station are into some of the other elements of the just transition, but there are a lot of transferable skills. And if you look on the slide on the thing on the right with the father and the kid, that's National Grid. So this is there are two articles. Every slide that I'm going to give you has got reading on because I'm an academic and like my DNA won't allow me to do anything else. But the future energy scenarios done by National Grid, they will show that like some fossil industry is still viable with carbon capture and storage. Some heavy industry, some energy intense industry is still possible if we allow ourselves to investigate and develop hydrogen production through electrolysis and all these different technologies. I'm not going to go into the technologies, but net zero industrial clusters are possible and can be developed. So it's just a case of some of these industries do need to search just transitions, but they also need to look to some of the emerging technologies that are viable. So that's one thing to think through in terms of electricity sector transitions. The others that are a little bit closer to home, like literally, are thinking about transitioning to a net zero economy. What does that mean for our homes? Now, most people will have heard that our homes in Britain are relatively energy inefficient. And most people might also think, given the opportunity to spend £10,000, the last thing I'm going to do is put some boring insulation in. I'm going to go on holiday, I'll buy a car. But given the level of stimulus needed, the level of insulation, the level of retrofit needed, the job creation potential for housing and small commercial retrofit is huge. And some work by the New Economics Foundation and some researchers at the University of Leeds have pointed to the fact that retrofit alone could be 500,000 jobs sustained over 10 to 15 years. So these are highly skilled, good jobs that can be maintained over a long period and critically have to be in every city. It's not something that you can zone in London and the Southeast. This has to work in the places where the retrofit happens. It can't do anything else. They also have the potential, well, they will reduce fuel poverty. They will build a supply chain in retrofit and smart energy systems. So looking towards the kind of domestic retrofit side is absolutely necessary because we cannot meet any of our climate change targets if we retain energy inefficient buildings and gas boilers. So that does mean a transition, but it's a much easier. My next door neighbour is a gas fitter. So I know that like they're already thinking, how do we learn about heat pumps? What do we need to know to retrofit them into homes? And they are transferable skills. And it's quite obvious that there's a skills gap in the trades to be able to retrofit a house safely and with some assurance. And the final thing about the kind of work of the hands is, what does COVID-19 do to rewrite the rules of how we use cities? And by cities, I don't just mean the centre of Newcastle, right? I mean all the way out into the suburbs, and how do we think of that urban area? And there's loads of articles. You can't turn around in the field that I'm in at the moment without some kind of relatively glib article about what does it mean for post-pandemic urban space. But it does raise some interesting questions, because when you start to work from home, as most of us have been doing a little bit if our jobs allow it, is that it's not all positive. All of a sudden, like, you're responsible for a heating bill throughout the day. And if you are living in one of those old energy efficient homes, the analysis that's been done suggests that you're not really making much of a carbon benefit by keeping your home warm all day rather than an office full of people. The other question that I would kind of bring up is, while that might allow us to repurpose some urban space for greenery, parks, restaurants, whatever it is, what does it mean for our kind of psychological well-being of bringing work into the home? Even this evening, we had a small toddler meltdown before the Zoom started, and I have to sort of do the emotional labour of hoping that everybody on the call is comfortable with that, and now we all kind of have to be comfortable with it. But I'm from a very privileged position of being an academic, and that's not true for everybody else. So what new pressures does that place on people in the home? I don't think we've fully understood that yet at all. And how long is it till we see people and job applications saying, you know, must be able to work from home sometimes, because companies are thinking about downsizing the amount of expensive urban office space that they use. So there's how we retrofit and do energy efficiency and make sure we've got decent homes. I've got an office, look, it's brilliant, because I had a little hole that was used for throwing the boxes in when we moved, and then didn't really do very much with it until all of a sudden it was important. But not everybody is in that position, and asking people to work from home is essentially putting the costs of employment back into the household, which has got a lot of problems attached to it. So when we start to think more systemically, it starts to be important for us to start to do some work of the head as well, and some thinking. And both speakers have already touched on this, and I would say anybody that's entering the climate debate, anybody that's starting out thinking about this, is yes, you can do loads yourself. You can cut down flying, you can not eat as much red meat, you can switch off lights, you can do all sorts. But that narrative, that idea that, well, what are you doing, is extremely disabling, because it sometimes takes away from what we need to do collectively. So if you individually responsibilize somebody, you will have seen it on the news. If an environmental campaigner comes in, some kind of hack will say, oh, well, I bet you've got an iPhone, or I bet you've flown this year. It's like, yes, fine, I am, because flights are cheap. What do you want me to say? Like, the reason why we have states, the reason why we have higher authority than ourselves, is so that we can engage in collective projects. So trying to note that individual responsibility story, note when you slip into it, and note when somebody's doing it to you, is a really important rhetorical tool to be able to draw on. And there's a link there. There's a lot of academic work on it, but the link is to a newspaper article. It's like 5 minutes to read. It's really good. The second one I wanted to point to is a really troubling, the work of the head is a really troubling trend, in terms of, if it's not an individual responsibility narrative, there's an othering of the problem. So we've seen the fairly disgusting videos of the news crews following migrant boats in the Channel. As a lifeboat volunteer myself, that made me physically sick, because anyone that's in an overloaded boat, you put on your vessel, simple as that. But it is playing to an othering of the problem. Now, I recognise that the current migrant crisis, if you want to use the term crisis, but the current issues around migration are not necessarily driven by climate change. Some will be, but not all. But we're starting to see threads of ecofascism and threads of right-wing nationalism in the environment debate, often around migration and population. And it's very, very important to be able to spot that as well. And spotting that isn't something that comes naturally, because it's a very easy rhetorical tool to say it's not your fault, it's somebody else's. So developing things like class consciousness, developing and understanding what solidarity actually means has been a historical role of unions. And I suspect that rediscovering that and thinking through that is very, very important to understand the environmental debate going forward, because if we don't, then we risk falling into traps of othering people who are in very, very similar situations to us, but for the want of luck. So I think rediscovering the idea of and discussing ideas of solidarity is just as much about tackling climate change as it is, talking about what kind of boilers we're going to have in our houses. They're both legitimate discussions. And then the final thing I wanted to talk about, and this is a book that I'm reading at the minute, and I find challenging to read. Like, some of the things that I'm going to recommend for reading shortly are tough jobs. It's not like pick up a pamphlet and give it a read. But this idea of perpetual economic growth, only in the service of providing jobs, whatever jobs. I mean, this is about green jobs and secure futures, but any recourse to, because it will drive growth, is a recourse to run out of ideas for other development policy. And I'm going to take the opportunity to just present that quote from Zygmunt Bauman, who was a Leeds professor for a long time, talking about the Church of Economic Growth. The meaning of making life better, or just rendering it somewhat less unsatisfactory, means to consume more. And he talks about how tightly packed the shops are and how much people are shopping and consuming is the marker by, wait until January. How were the Christmas sales? Why are we in a position where our economy is dependent on us buying tat that we don't need on a religious holiday and then reporting that for the following 2 months? It's because we've created a monster and we just need to keep feeding it. But if you're going to do the real kind of some real interesting work, start to think about and question the need for growth and jobs to provide the basis for human flourishing. So we need to understand questions like why we chase growth, why capitalism is growth dependent. Any discussion about climate change that doesn't mention capitalism because they're scared of sounding like a lunatic is missing some of the point. Like, some of this is a systemic issue, and that is why individual responsibility narrative doesn't always work. And capitalism is the mode of production that we live under, so it's worth understanding. Who's thinking about a post-growth world? What are they saying? Are we going to spend the next 30 years talking about green growth and then realize that green growth is just a way of slowing down an inevitable realization that you cannot grow a system forever, particularly not at a compound rate of growth of kind of 3% year on year? So these questions are legitimate questions for public sector workers to ask, because they are going to be informing the types of economic development policy we find legitimate, the types of planning policy that we find legitimate, and the types of even healthcare policy and the way that we fund our healthcare services, which we think are viable in the future. So that's a real call to do some of the thinking work, as well as some of the earlier work as retrofitting and energy sector decarbonisation and just transitions. And the final thing I want to do is just point to a few things that I found really helpful. Spoiler alert, the white one over there, the spatial contract, that's my book, and I've got to get a book in, I'm like contractually obliged. But the real kind of heavy hitters in the field, and some of these will be on the bookshelves of the people sitting on the call now, but Donut Economics, fantastic book, explains why economics totally lost its way, and we need a real deep rethinking of what it means to be an economist. And when these people come on the BBC and they are an economist, it's like, what type of economist and what assumptions are we making? That's very important. George Monbiot's Feral, excellent book, talks about our human need for some kind of ecological interaction in cities and beyond. Rebel Cities by David Harvey talks about capitalism and why it produces tensions in different places, and that capitalism never solves its problems. It moves them around geographically, which is why you find, depressed areas in a country very close to, thriving areas. And obviously, as a fellow northerner, albeit further south, I can very much attest to that. If you want something to really bum you out, then The Uninhabitable Earth by David Wallace Wells is the place to start. But if you feel like you need that shake of a wake-up call, is climate change a problem? Yes, it is. but you should probably read this with cake because you're going to need some kind of leveler out because it's a bit of a bummer. And then I'm not going to go through all of them because I don't think it's useful. I will point to the fact that on a Unison call, I've given you a book by Len McCluskey, which is the leader of a different union. That just gave me a sad cake for being a little bit naughty. But thinking about what is trade unionism and how it can contribute to our collective well-being will form you as part of a wider collective project, and that is a useful thing to ground yourself in. And then finally, I do want to point to the case for a Green New Deal, because this idea of a New Deal and a kind of jobs first, now COVID recovery, it was first conceived of as a climate change, as a 2008 financial crisis recovery. But this idea of a Green New Deal is critically important to kind of capture the fact that what we're looking at is a much bigger kind of economic and society-wide New Deal, rather than just something that a local government or a city authority can necessarily manage on its own. And that is a bigger political project. And again, to be part of that bigger political project is to empower yourself to take action on climate change that might start at home, but it's part of a bigger thing. It's difficult to wash out your yogurt pots and put them in the recycling when they're drilling for oil in the Arctic. Those things often cause a bit of cognitive dissonance. So finally, I'll finish with a quote that you guys can read at your leisure, but it's a call to, yes, do the work. It's a call to start doing something, that's fine. But it's also a call to find it legitimate to stop and think, and stop and read, stop and find out more. A climate change meeting in a union branch might well be a book club meeting. We've read this thing, we want to understand it more deeply. That will contribute to lessening some of the anxiety of doing the wrong thing, or coming out the wrong side of the argument, or falling into traps that are laid by those who have got less than perfect motivations. So there's a call for, yeah, it's great to do Green New Deal stuff, and we do know how to do it, but thinking about this more deeply, because it is a big, seemingly intractable problem, is a useful place to start as well. And now I can stop sharing. Look at that, it worked.
Hey, thank you very much. So yeah, I think you've really set out clearly, touching some of the issues that like the rest of the series is going to come on to discuss. So you know, touching on some of the kind of like heavier fossil fuel intensive industries, carbon intensive industries. We've got one of our events in November talking specifically around those sectors and how we transition, touching on homes and transport, which are things that I'm sure will be relevant to kind of some of Nick's work, and particularly the event we're having next month as well. So it's a really helpful kind of overview to take us into the series of like, what do we mean by climate change and the work that needs to be done. I think what we can't be in any doubt after hearing it is the amount of work that we do need to get on with, and you know, quite urgently. So thank you again, and I'll now introduce our final speaker of the evening, Nick Forbes, leader of Newcastle City Council and Senior Vice Chair of the Local Government Association. So Nick, hearing that the context that Claire's really clearly set out of the desperate need for secure employment in this area, I was going to say coming out of COVID, but I'm not sure we can say that, you know, going through the impacts of COVID, and as well, you know, the kind of all that work that is desperately needed to tackle climate change. I don't know if you can kind of touch on what that kind of looks like from your perspective in terms of that job potential and how we kind of approach that in terms of putting it in motion.
Thanks, Rona. And I found all of the contributions this evening to be really, really inspiring and really informative. So thanks for organising this session. I feel a bit like a second-rate speaker compared to the people that have just gone before me. But what I want to do is talk about why Newcastle, why now, why what we're doing is really significant, and what we need to do in order to accelerate the pace of change. One of the things that I sometimes hear, and Steve touched on this as well, is the kind of, well, but the UK only produces 1.5% of global carbon emissions, so why should we bother when other places like China or America produce far more than we do? And why does it really matter to us anyway? Because climate change doesn't affect us. Well, I want to share an image which, for me, absolutely demonstrates the need for change in this country. This was a development called Spencer Court in Newcastle. And Spencer Court was destroyed, as you can see, by an extraordinary weather event back in 2012, when one of the big culverts in that part of the city collapsed. And you can see just behind the building the huge amount of water. And you can see under the building the pilings that were driven into the ground for the building to stand on, where the ground has just been washed away from underneath them. And that for me is a shocking illustration of the impact of climate change in my city, in this country, in this, well, actually in the last decade, let alone this decade. So anybody who says that it isn't a pressing problem, look at that image and understand that we have to do something about this. And the other thing that I think we have a responsibility for is a moral responsibility. We often tell the story of Newcastle about how proud we are that Newcastle drove the Industrial Revolution, and it's what forged our city's prosperity. You know, the steam locomotive, the steam turbine, the electric light bulb. We have a phrase in English about what it is to do a futile act, and it's to bring coals to Newcastle, because our city was built and founded on coal and the coal industry. And many of the railways that were invented specifically to get coal from the coal mines onto the quayside in Newcastle, where it could be exported all the way around the world. So I think we have a moral responsibility, because in the Industrial Revolution, we carbonized the global economy. And I think we have a moral responsibility to lead the decarbonisation of the global economy too. And that's why I'm setting Newcastle up as the leading city in the UK. Of course, lots of people will say that they're competing for that title, but I want us to be the leading city in the UK to really understand what it is to tackle climate change in every part of our city's business, in every part of our city's life, in every community in our city. We were the first council in the Northeast to declare a climate emergency. We've created a cross-party climate change committee, which I, as leader, chair, because I feel it needs high-level political sponsorship for people to be able to see it being taken seriously. And we've created a new partnership, a net zero task force, which involves all of the public sector, the big public sector partners, plus quite a lot of private sector partners, in coming up with what are the bold, imaginative changes that we need to make as a city, and what are the investments that we need to make as a city to drive us forward. And I was also, by the way, instrumental in getting the LGA nationally to declare a climate emergency last year. And I do my best to keep raising the issue at every level in national conversations as well as locally, because for me, climate change isn't a policy that sits over there while social care sits over here and economic development sits over here and transport sits over here. Climate change is going to shape the work, all of the rest of my time in politics, all the rest of everybody's lives who are watching this call. We need to understand it, embed it in everything that we do in order to make a structural, systematic difference to the way that we live our lives. And there are a number of things that we need to do this. Firstly, we need empowered local government. And we need local government which is able to lead change, bring together the right partners, and make the kind of investments that we need to make the kind of step changes that will deliver for us. And we know that we've had a decade of austerity. We know that councils have faced cuts year after year after year. That's had a huge impact on our workforce and our capacity. But if we're serious about tackling this, we need to reinvest in our local authorities as the natural conveners of place to bring together the partners to really drive change. We need to absolutely oppose the government's planning reforms that have been announced in quiet over the summer, which are aiming to take away from local communities the ability to determine planning applications. And because what we need is a level of democratic control at a local level over the planning decisions that affect people's lives. And I know from talking to other Labour leaders around the country, there is a huge ambition there to set out very bold policies whether it's about mineral extraction or lack of mineral extraction, whether it's about new types of house building, whether it's about designing transport systems that are genuinely focused on walking and cycling in public transport rather than private car usage. We've got a huge ambition to do that in Labour local government. And what we don't want is the government to tear up the rule books that we're putting in place to enable us to control development at a local level. We also, though, need, I think, massive devolution of skills funding and the skills system, because it's very clear the COVID crisis is accelerating a whole range of changes that were already starting to take place in the economy. Whether that's the way that people shop, whether it's people's working patterns, whether it's people's travel patterns, we know that we're seeing change on an unprecedented level. And we know that there are going to be some parts of our economy where we're going to see massive job losses. We're already starting to see it in the retail sector, in the cultural sector. We'll see it in hospitality and leisure too. And I don't think we can afford to have yet another lost generation to mass unemployment. I grew up in the Northeast in the 1980s. I know how scarring mass unemployment is on our communities. And we've got to do everything that we can to avoid that happening again. So that's why we need devolution of skills funding, so that we can, in parallel, both stimulate the creation of a whole new generation of jobs broadly associated with the carbon neutral economy, and train people to do those jobs. We need to do that in parallel. And local government needs to be arguing for the right kind of infrastructure investment for us to do that. One of my worries about where this government is at is you often hear them saying, we want things to get back to normal. We want to turn the clock back. We want to get things back to how they used to be. I think that's a fundamental mistake. One of the things, if there is a benefit from the COVID crisis, is that for the first time in our lives, we don't have to imagine what the world could be like with less traffic, with less economic activity based on consumption. We experienced it. And so what we need to do is use that as a point of change to really drive forward a different agenda. But the government isn't on that page yet. So when we talk about infrastructure investment, the government tends to think of things like road investment, major road, bypasses and motorways and road extensions, not cycling infrastructure, not broadband infrastructure, not low carbon energy production, not retrofitting of domestic and commercial properties, all of which have the huge potential to create thousands and thousands of new jobs. In fact, actually, the biggest single opportunity to create new jobs in the economy is in retrofitting of housing. And many of us will live in older properties that are not very energy efficient. And although a lot of the housing debate tends to be on new build standards, and that's not unimportant, actually that's a tiny proportion of the housing stock, and will be a tiny proportion of the housing stock for quite a considerable period of time to come. The real gains will come from retrofitting existing housing stock and inventing the new ways in which we can do that, that goes far beyond just putting an extra layer of insulation in the loft. We've got, for example, in our housing, our council house provider, Your Homes Newcastle, they've invented a robot that does underfloor insulation. And that's another way of which we can get a layer of insulation into people's homes to reduce energy costs, but also to reduce energy consumption. And we also need to be really bold and imaginative and hold our political nerve when it comes to new types of transport infrastructure. People that know Newcastle will know that Newcastle was redesigned in the 1960s around the private car. And the idea was that people should be able to drive wherever they want to, park wherever they want to, and that represented a kind of freedom. But that freedom came with a huge cost. And we're just seeing that now in terms of air quality and poor public health. And that sense that, that kind of sense of a right to be able to drive wherever you want and park wherever you want is part of, I think, the kind of move to individualism, which is undermining that sense of collective purpose and endeavour, which is the kind of spirit that I think was on show in the COVID crisis that we need to capture and bottle for the movement that we need ahead. And that's why in Newcastle, like many other towns and cities around the UK, We're experimenting with new cycle lanes, experimenting with widening pedestrian areas, experimenting with taking cars out of our city centres. Us politicians are being screamed at for doing that. My cabinet member for transport and air quality has had some pretty appalling stuff on social media and so on, but we're holding our nerve because I don't think it's right that adults should be able to veto the health of future generations of our children. And so we're holding our nerve because we think this is a real moment in time, and a time when we can really capture that sense of change. And those jobs that I'm talking about can't just be piecemeal jobs where we get small-scale private contractors to just take on extra bits of work. We've got to think really systematically about not just what those generations of jobs will do and what skills they need, but we need to think about what governance that will be in place. How do we make sure that this isn't basically just another gig economy where people are being ripped off without good terms and conditions and on part-time pay and with payment by the hour or payment by the job? We need to make sure that these are decent, secure, well-paid jobs that are respected in our communities and where people feel that they can do those jobs as a decent career with decent career progression. And that means basically reinventing the world of work around the Green New Deal and what that looks like for the future. And we've also got to lead by example. Claire, you talked about public buildings. And again, we're doing that here in Newcastle with the investment that we're making in the Civic Centre, which was a building that was built long before anybody thought about things like energy conservation. And the opposition have tried to have a go at us on that, but we're holding our nerve again and saying, actually, it's right that we have energy efficient buildings. It's right that we have good working conditions for staff. It's not unreasonable for people to be able to access drinking water on the same floor that they work in, or have toilets on the same floor that they work in. Those are all, I think, perfectly sensible, reasonable things for us to do in the working environment. But the other thing that we have to do, and I think this is the real role of local government as leaders of place, is that we have to build that sense of community consent and a contract and buy-in to this sense of change. This can't be about taking things away from people. This can't be a negative agenda, which is about stopping people living the lives that they live and making them feel that their lives are being curtailed. This has to be a positive agenda, which feels like it's offering opportunities for future generations, as well as helping people to reimagine what it is to live in a cleaner, more pleasant world where we enjoy the green space and air quality around us that we've experienced, many of us, for the first time in the last 6 months. And there's a saying that I think is particularly apt here when we're talking about climate change, which is that you get really positive change when old folks plant trees under whose shade they'll never sit. And that's, I think, our job as politicians in this world today. I won't see in my lifetime the long-term benefits of reducing carbon, but that's the kind of leadership that I think we need in our towns and cities and in our national government now, in order to make sure that our world, our planet is protected for future generations to come. Thanks, Rona.
Thank you very much, Nick. That was really, really helpful. I totally agree. The moral responsibility for decarbonising and making it every part of the city's business. And I suppose for that to work, likewise, it has to be all of our business. And we need that to be able to achieve that for Newcastle or for any other city. I think you made some really helpful kind of like key points there to bring to people's attention as well around specific things like planning reforms, which I'm sure people will take away and have a look at. And that we can't afford to lose another generation to unemployment, particularly when you've kind of articulated so well how there is this opportunity there. And actually, if we don't take that opportunity, it would be immoral, not only because of the climate crisis, but to this generation who have been impacted by austerity, but also by COVID and all of that fallout. So thank you so much for kind of setting that out so clearly. And also kind of talking about that skills gap and how we kind of how we kind of address that. We have had some questions around that. I'm going to just have a look through and see, maybe pick out just one or two, because we haven't got a huge amount of time. One question which, if I can ask you, Nick, to have a kind of see if you've got any thoughts on. We've had a specific question around transport. So specifically, it's from Charles Foreman, who has said, you know, we need a flexible travel scheme whereby people who don't use the train every day can book tickets at a discount to make it more affordable. Does anyone know if there's any move on this this front in the Northeast? Could be increasingly relevant if people are working fewer hours in the office. So I suppose if it's not like a regular transport, but I suppose the wider kind of question on that, and it's something we're looking at particularly in the next month's session of this, will be around transport, and we'll have a bit of a greater focus. But I suppose on that issue of transport, is there anything, because obviously tackling climate change and transport for climate change is also making it more affordable. Yeah.
It's probably a whole seminar, as they say, by itself, transport, but just a few observations. Firstly, at the moment, season passes for commuters are 5-day workday passes, and we need a much more flexible approach to how ticketing works. Apart from London, we have a deregulated transport system around the UK, and part of the ambition that we have with some of the devolution agenda is that we would then be able to re-regulate buses and bring that, make buses work in tandem with light rail and local rail systems. When I was the transport lead for the North East Combined Authority, I actually renationalised the metro. Which is something I'm very proud of, but don't actually talk about very much. Because if you remember, it used to be outsourced to DB Regio, which was, I suppose, nationalisation in a way, but nationalisation to a German rail company rather than a British rail company. And it made absolutely no sense to have the track and the operation and the train operations separate from each other. So we brought that back together as one unit with the idea that that was the first part of starting to create an integrated transport system for Tyne and Wear. What we need next are the buses, so that we can make sure that they work collaboratively with that. And the significant problem that we have with transport is the cost of it, particularly the affordability of it. We have in Newcastle some of the highest bus fares in the UK for length of journey. If I get the bus into the civic centre, it costs me £2.20 for a 1.5 mile journey, whereas you can do any journey in London for £1.50 within an hour, and you can even change buses within that time. So if we're going to be serious about encouraging people to change, it's not just about telling people that they need to be nice to the environment by using their car less. We need to give people positive financial incentives by making public transport cheaper across the board. Not just cheaper and not just more accessible, but actually more reliable too, which is why, going back to reimagining our city centres, we need to really build in priority for buses, for public transport, cycling and walking. And yes, I'm sorry, that does mean at the expense of the private car, but actually that's the only way we're really going to make people shift in significant numbers and see the kind of impact on our transport emissions, which are about, for Newcastle, are probably like most places, are about 1/3 of our overall emissions. That's the only way we're going to start to have a serious impact on those, if we have an integrated system that's affordable for people and with practical positive incentives for change.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Nick. And just one final question. We've got a question from Kat Hudson. It's for Stephen or Nick, but I'm going to ask Claire. Claire, if you're all right to kind of pick up on this one. It's around kind of that skills gap. And if we're talking about, we'll come on to talk about again this one in a lot of detail, because it's around kind of transitioning people's skills and whose responsibility is it? Is it, if we're looking at a company, is it that, that employer, that entity who's responsible for that transition skills, or do we need to look elsewhere? who should be kind of taking that responsibility, or is it a shared responsibility? We do have, just while we're on the topic, next month we've got the CEO of Newcastle College Group, which was one of the biggest further education providers in the country. So I think it'd be really interesting as well to kind of hear her perspective on where FE can kind of, as a, you know, a struggling sector already, but where that opportunity is for FE. Claire, have you got anything, any kind of thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I mean, thanks, Rona. And I mean, I guess for me, listening to Nick answering about transport, for me, there's a common theme, and this is why this is such an important area generally for UNISON as a trade union, because actually it's about what type of choices are being made. And it comes back to the point that Steve and others have made. These are political choices. So, you know, our role is to bring people together collectively to get the best for everyone, and also to influence decision makers. And it's quite clear that one of the themes that runs across all of this conversation is the political choices that have been being made over the last period of time actually have meant that we're not well placed to positively address some of these issues. So yet we have deregulated transport because actually it was all about being there for profit, which means that's great, but then all of the unprofitable routes that people in communities that are isolated needed to be able to access and not use individual cars no longer run. You know, so, and I think it's a fairly similar response around education. So from a UNISON perspective, we see education as lifelong. And I think, you know, we've been doing a lot of work around highlighting for the last few years, again, that marketization model that has been introduced to particularly further education and colleges, but also to our universities and higher education, isn't a model that is sustainable for bringing around positive change, because again, it's about income generation, it's about numbers of people, and increasingly what we've seen are organisations making decisions on they will only offer certain courses if they're profitable. And we've seen a government that are pushing higher education institutions to only offer choices that deliver on certain things. So, you know, that's why it's important for UNISON as a public sector trade union, because we've got a lot of knowledge base from our members who deliver these services, but also from that broader social justice to be saying, hang on a minute, we're not making the right political decisions here to tackle some of these issues. And I think, you know, the skills gap is an absolutely fundamental question. And I think it is a shared responsibility. So, you know, I think it's about us working with Labour politicians like Nick and others around saying, well, what investment do we want in adult skills? Actually, how do we make sure that we're funding a skills programme that is delivering on positive skills development and actually is linked to job creation that Steve, Nick and others have talked about in terms of sustainable jobs, in terms of supporting people to be able to retrain. Also, you know, I think, Steve, you talked about the skills gap in terms of gas fitters, or, you know, actually we should be having training programs in colleges that are already starting to address that, so that we are starting to train people in those skills. But again, we have an approach that's very market driven, here and now, got to make a profit, as opposed to a longer term strategy that is saying, this is our population, actually these are the really important issues we've got to address. We need to be developing green jobs as an example. What are the skills that we need to support people to get to be able to do that? And we don't have that political philosophy at the minute. I do think what we can do regionally and locally, particularly where we've got devolution deals, for example, is we are getting more control of some of that, where we prioritise placing that funding. Actually, the people we really reach out to, Newcastle's been doing, and North of Tyne, some great work around growing, you know, inclusive jobs, so that people who perhaps have been out of work are given support as opposed to punitive measures so that they can get the skills that are required to be able to get jobs and to deliver their own training. So that's a bit of a long answer, but I think you've got to understand the context of these things. But I think it's a shared responsibility, and we all have to come together to get some different political choices nationally being made around this. And that's why UNISON is also saying we need significant investment in our colleges and our universities going forwards.
Thank you. I think that's a brilliant place to end, to be fair, because that's what we need to go forward, isn't it? So that's all for tonight, and thank you for all of our speakers for, I think, a really fascinating discussion, and for making that path out of you know, the jobs crisis that we're really only seeing the start of, and the path towards a more carbon neutral region a bit clearer. And as Claire pointed out at the beginning, we know that our members are going through really difficult times at the minute. But we also know that this government isn't going to get us out of it. So it's really vital that we have these conversations and start making these plans and working together, because our members' futures are the priority. So on that note, that's all for tonight. And then our next event in this series is Wednesday, the 23rd of September at 7 p.m. So we'll be talking about jobs again, housing and transport in more detail, and we'll have a whole new brilliant panel of speakers. So thank you very much for joining us, and we'll see you then.
Thank you, Rona. Excellently chaired, and thank you to the other speakers. I thought it was really interesting. I've learned quite a lot, so thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.